Good morning, everybody. It says here I'm supposed to gavel. I don't have one, so to order. Again, thank you all for attending this morning's PAC DBIA meeting. It's a very strong indication of the administration's continued focus on Africa. We in the PAC DBIA are very interested in working with the administration and really continuing the focus on working together and bringing an America approach and a United States approach between the private sector and the USG. We've been working over the last couple of months on a task from the Secretary on identifying issues around approaching Africa, competing in Africa, and operating in Africa. And we will address those today in the remarks from our colleagues as we go through the morning around some of the issues that we see in those three key areas. And we will then address going forward how to address some of those issues and continue to move forward from driving economic growth in Africa, along with continuing to drive U.S. business activity in Africa as well. So I will again thank you all for attending. Secretary, thank you for your support, continued support, and I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Great. Thanks, Jay, and good morning, everyone. I am really pleased to be here today as part of the PAC DBIA because I do truly believe that collectively we can accomplish great things together to advance an American approach for the continent. My name is Laura Lane, and I'm honored to serve as the Vice Chair for the PAC DBIA. And like all of you, my career has given me an incredibly deep appreciation for all the good that comes out of boosting the trade and commercial relationship between countries, particularly in the African continent. And in this case, we're focused on the sub-Saharan Africa with all of the diversity of opportunities and challenges that exist in the markets that brings opportunities for American companies, but requires that partnership with government to really realize those opportunities. So we have an incredibly esteemed group of public and private sector representatives coming together today under your leadership, Mr. Secretary, to find the solutions and mutually beneficial opportunities for growth. So I look forward to reviewing the report with everyone this morning, but let me turn it back over to you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Jay and Laura, for your leadership on this council, and I thank all of the members of the council for your ongoing work. And finally, I thank the National Security Council for graciously hosting this meeting. That's their fourth time doing so during the 3 years that the PAC DBIA has been in existence. I'm pleased to finally meet the PAC DBIA in person. It has been 3 months since we all met by phone, and I pose to you on behalf of the President a set of tasks intended to channel your varied experiences. I asked you to make recommendations that would inform U.S. government strategies to help make American companies pursue, win, and execute business opportunities in Africa. Specifically, I asked, 1, what are the 3 biggest factors that keep American companies from approaching African markets? 2, what are the biggest obstacles to the success of American companies already competing in Africa? 3rd, from the perspective of American companies already established in Africa, what are the 3 characteristics of African markets that most hinder the ability of American companies to operate effectively and efficiently? Today, you have convened to adopt a report that I hope provides the answers to these questions. We'll be discussing each of the 9 issues in the report in some detail, which means we have quite a bit of business to do today. So I'll stop here and just say I'm looking forward to an interesting and active discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate those remarks. Cyril, would you like to make a few remarks as well?
No. I just once again thank all of you for the effort that you put into the report, and we are listening attentively.
Okay, great. All right, as I said, the report has been worked on between the PAC DBIA companies as well as the government agencies, and we want to introduce that report to the committee. And again, the context, was the Secretary mentioned, was around what are the obstacles, issues, potential around approaching Africa, competing in Africa, and then operating in Africa for U.S. companies. So I'll turn it over to Laura to work us through the report.
So, Mr. Secretary, in order to pursue, win, and execute on deals in Africa, the Council got together and focused on those three areas of approaching, competing, and operating in this market. And we're going to focus first on the first set of issues with respect to approaching business in Africa. What are the key issues that companies face when they're considering expanding into Africa? And this includes American firms that are looking to export their products into African markets, as well as those that are thinking about putting in a physical presence or concluding business contracts with partners in various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And the principles of the Council identified the idea of distinguishing between not just perceived, but those actual market risks, because both of them come into play in terms of limiting the types of companies that decide to approach the African market as a possibility, and really harnessing market size and demand as the core issues for approaching the continent for those opportunities. So I want to turn it over to Barbara for some initial comments along those lines.
Thank you, Laura and Jay, and thank you, fellow council members and Commerce staff. We really appreciate you convening this. Mr. Secretary, as a small business owner operating in Africa for the last 20 years, I've had a firsthand understanding of the obstacles facing American business in doing business in Africa. However, I am still there, but in summarizing what our council has determined are the obstacles other U.S. businesses have in following us to the continent, we have identified that the aspects of risk, perceived versus actual, is a significant element in and of itself. It is clear that African markets offer multiple opportunities for U.S. businesses to grow their operations on the continent, as this is being done by businesses from other nations as well. Yet the rate of expansion does not reflect the potential growth for American companies in Africa. As I mentioned, as a group, the Council identified risk, both perceived and actual, as a concern for U.S. business. In my experience, the actual risks are not that different from any other part of the world. Yet, U.S. companies continue to be reticent to compete or even consider the continent. I believe that we need to reignite the pioneering spirit that is a core American value and overcome these obstacles and head east to Africa. The perceived risk and actual risks we categorize under the following headings: legal regulatory risk, foreign exchange risk, liquidity risk, political risk, and headline risk. What do these risk categories mean to businesses as they consider approaching African markets? The legal and regulatory risk can be defined as the rules of the road when learning to navigate in African markets. The perceived risks are found in the enforceability of contracts, the dependability of the regulatory and tax process, and the consistency of the legal process. For many U.S. companies considering Africa, the rules of the road are perceived as weak or difficult to navigate. Foreign exchange risk, liquidity risk, perceived or actual risk. Money is the fuel of business, and the perception that central bank functions that support free movement of funds, along with economic controls to have stable currencies, is a major issue for companies considering Africa. The political risks. There's a perception that the political environment is not stable and regime change is not democratic. The reality is that several key countries in Africa have gone through several peaceful democratic electoral cycles. And finally, what we describe as headline risk. This can be defined in the loose analogy I've been putting in place as the road signs on the road, the stop or go signs, which come in the ways of news headlines about anti-money laundering violations, Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctions, or other prominent events. In summary, we identified these 4 areas under the broad category of risk in the evaluation stage being done by companies as they approach African markets. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Barbara. Aaron, did you want to maybe add some additional comments? Aaron Walsh of the Department of Commerce.
Yeah, key things is really trying to work with them to look at opportunities abroad. And all of them. Certainly.
In all of them, one of the first things of small and medium-sized businesses consider is, where should I go? There are over 2.2 million exportable companies here in the United States, and only 330,000 of them actually export. And the majority of those places are to Canada, to Mexico, and to China. And we look at this and we say, why aren't they doing more? And I think one of our roles is to look at how we can help them and influence them in reshaping the image of Africa, perhaps not even as a continent, but as individual countries, and promote those opportunities. And I think the leadership of the U.S. companies that have already been there and blazed the trail, if they can help work with us to identify areas where there are opportunities for these small and medium-sized companies, because I think that's the way that we can do it. There is risk, and they definitely feel it.
Thank you, Erin. Eric Meyer of the Treasury Department, did you want to interject as well?
Thank you, Laura, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I think one of the important parts you made, Barbara, was that there are risks, and there are risks in Africa like there are everywhere in the world that American businesses are active or trying to be engaged. The challenge in Africa, as you said, is a perception that for some reason the bar is so much higher. And I think it's really important that you all have put out and began to draw out in more detail what some of those perceptions are, so that we can work together to try and find ways to clarify and to bring light onto what those issues are. So I think it's really important that you've highlighted some of these. I think legal and regulatory risk is one that we hear very frequently when we are meeting with American companies that are either interested in or actually active on the continent, and I think that's really important. I think I can just be brief right now, as we're going to talk a little bit later on about some of the foreign exchange and liquidity risk issues, so I don't need to go into that a whole lot more. I did think it was interesting in your headline risk that you all highlighted things like anti-money laundering violations and U.S. sanctions, and I think that points to it points to a real risk, but it's a real risk that's everywhere. And I think from our experience, I wouldn't say that the use of sanctions or the violations that we've seen are disproportionately in Africa. So I think that is an area where we need to try and get some clarity. But you do point out an issue which is, for us, a macroeconomic fundamental issue, which is that countries across the continent need to be investing in their legal and regulatory regimes so that they are able to operate at the highest standards. Thank you.
We can open the floor for any additional comments that anyone might have. Otherwise, let me recognize Fred Sisson to present on underdeveloped capital markets and some of the challenges that presents for approaching the continent.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for having us. Capital markets provide a conduit for private sector funds to flow through to African projects. What we've seen is a good scenario. Africa growth has really now started outpacing the ability of public sector funds to keep up with the growth. But capital markets, the investments present a substantial opportunity to U.S. businesses to provide goods and services to African customers. The private sector has a desire to participate in this growth, but the capital markets need to but efficient capital markets are needed to realize this investment interest. There are a few. The Council has identified the following barriers to efficient private sector capital flows to Africa. One is the access to and the cost of capital. Currently, capital is not readily available in all markets, and the costs of that capital are sometimes prohibitively high for the investments. Number two, markets lack the financial transparency, data, and standards needed to attract private sector capital to those markets. Number three, debt and equity market liquidity is shallow or illiquid. In many of these markets, the capital markets are fairly underutilized. They don't have a lot of external participation, and that doesn't create the momentum that are needed to finance the projects that are happening within those markets. Number 4, basic financial infrastructure such as telecommunications and internet is missing or needs improvement in many of these areas. For example, the data transfer required for capital markets in order to keep them flowing smoothly is running over antiquated systems. They're not able to communicate internally effectively or externally, which erodes confidence from private sector. Number 5, regulatory frameworks and institutions are underdeveloped and lack standardization. And I think that this is more of an education issue in many of these markets. The capital markets are relatively new. They're managed sometimes by folks that are not as educated or as experienced in Western capital markets. And so what ends up happening is the frameworks that are required to gain confidence from external investors aren't necessarily there. So confidence is impacted. That concludes my statements.
Let me turn it over to Kareem Mohtahami to present. Before we go to you, Cheryl, would you like to add some comments from the perspective of USAID? Because I think you have some very valuable insights to share that focus on the points that Fred just presented on.
Sure. Thank you very much. Let me say a couple things at the outset. USAID takes this input from the PAC-DBIA very seriously, and we really appreciate the coordinated and strategic inputs of the report. We work with African countries, with economic communities, and with the private sector to reduce barriers to trade and investment, and also to foster linkages between U.S. and African firms. And we do this in a number of ways, including our regional trade hubs that we have in Nairobi, Accra, and South Africa, and also through Power Africa's whole-of-government approach in Africa's energy sector. So in terms of the report, I think for us it would be very helpful to prioritize the subtopics and really highlight the binding constraints so that we can understand where we can be most constructive in supporting American businesses. And then just one other thought is that on information communications and information communications technology, it might be broken out as a separate subtopic because it has such a broad nature, and also this is a sector that's so important for Africa's development. Thanks.
Just a quick reminder for everyone, since this is live, it'd be important that everybody turn on their microphones so that they can catch it on the live stream and everybody can hear the valuable comments being made. Let me turn it over to David Bohegan from OPIC, because I know you have some good insights to share related to the underdeveloped capital markets and ways in which OPIC is partnering.
Great, thank you, Laura, and thank you for the council for this great report. I would just highlight this through the spectrum of an investor before I did it through the OPIC lens, which is everyone in this room understands that it's a risk-reward ratio for investors, and that the report does a nice job of highlighting the rewards, and all of you who are building infrastructure in telecom and healthcare there understand that. But what I believe governments in Africa have failed to understand is the perceived and actual risk they're creating by trying to manage their risk, whether that's currency exchange or interest rates. It's an important factor for the U.S. government as part of its commercial diplomacy aspect to ensure that we're talking to folks who are less experienced in economics than some of our people here. One thing that OPIC is doing in that regard is, as Secretary Ross serves on our board, he'll be seeing a board deal come up with a foreign currency exchange deal, which these capital markets are particularly underdeveloped. We've seen private equity players get into Africa, the depth of the capital markets aren't there, and in particular, it's stunning to me to find that you can't find the sort of 5 or 10 or 20-year tenor that you might need in local currency exchange, which typically falls on the most vulnerable. So I think that's an aspect of the report that I believe should be highlighted as well. So thank you for your work there.
Thank you, David. Kimberly, do you want to provide some additional thoughts as well?
Thank you. So my company, Amethyst Technologies, is a small business. We represent a U.S. pharmaceutical company who manufactures TheraWorks in Asheville, North Carolina, and we distribute their product in Ghana. The advantages they had in Ghana were approval in the FDA there took about 3 months and cost less than $10,000. The challenges we have as a small business are access to capital. 90+ days for payment, if we're lucky in many cases, and we have to pay 13 to 15% interest rates for a line of credit. So if there are programs that are right-sized for small businesses that can provide access to capital at a low cost, also programs that don't require significant time to implement, that would be very beneficial for small businesses and all businesses in Africa. Thank you.
Any other comments that anyone would like to add?
Yes, I would like to add one thing. One of the things that I've seen over the last 7 years there, especially in Kenya, but also in other countries, Nigeria, et cetera, is a tremendous entrepreneurial small business focus by both Americans that are there as well as the African people, and it's around innovation. They are solving problems. They've got tremendous capability and developing tremendous solutions, especially solar home systems, et cetera. And the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that is a real constrictor of their growth is the underdeveloped capital markets, the cost of money, number one, the accessibility of money. And as we think about environments that spur innovation here in the U.S., the ability to exit, if you will, or to continue to get investment going forward. So the under liquidation, or I should say the lack of liquidity in the markets, where the typical venture capital of what we see here in the U.S. is somewhat non-existent. There are people that do it, but there's also a real potential to really drive growth both in Africa as well as here from some of the products that are being developed here as well.
Thank you, Jay. One of the other important elements in terms of approaching Africa is that analysis about market size and whether the demand is there and whether there is a readiness for U.S. business both to enter those markets and thrive in those markets. So now let me turn it over to Takreem El-Tohami.
So thank you, Laura, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for the time and support you're giving to the Council. So Africa is an attractive market and is a long-term growth opportunity. However, there are several issues that slow down U.S. businesses approaching Africa. Two important ones are diversity and competition. So Africa is home today to over 1 billion potential consumers. By 2050, its size will increase by an additional 1.3 billion people, estimated to house 26% of the global population. However, Africa is not one market. The diversity and variations of market conditions within and across the 49 sub-Saharan African countries make approaching Africa challenging for U.S. companies. One solution often does not fit every country's needs and conditions. Scaling business is hard, and smaller market size often equates to smaller deal sizes, which stresses the business model of some larger U.S. companies. Also, small and medium U.S. businesses are challenged to assess and navigate the size dynamics due in part to lack of skilled market research firms who can advise on market preference and tailoring products to a market and the expense of doing so for each potential market they are exploring for entry. Now, on the side of competition, some U.S. companies are supporting better health and disease prevention initiatives, IT enablement, ecosystem development, education, and skills development, and more to increase market size within countries. For example, earlier this year, the IBM CEO announced the Digital Nation Africa Initiative, which will support 25 million African youth with access to free skills development programs around much needed technology skills like digital, cognitive, cloud, application development, data analytics, and entrepreneurship. Historically, companies that have helped countries in this manner have benefited from a spillover effect of larger market size, goodwill, and demand for their companies' products and services. Today, such U.S. company investment spillover is being diluted by increased competition in corporate social responsibility, especially from companies in China and India, whose corporate and service and social responsibility programs were nascent or non-existent just a decade ago. Further, while the U.S. government also has numerous impactful programs to support market creation opportunities for U.S. companies, the Chinese government is also providing more assistance. The Chinese aid centers the Chinese aid centers rely heavily on concessional and semi-concessional loans for infrastructure and export credits, but support for their social development projects are on the rise. So, as more nations join the U.S. in market creation efforts across the African continent, the corresponding awareness, demand, and goodwill for products and services could likely migrate away from the U.S. toward the newly engaged nations. As a result, U.S. companies will receive fewer positive spillover effects from their investments, despite some of the ongoing efforts from the U.S. government to facilitate market opportunities in the region. So the size and spillover market dynamics dissuade U.S. companies from approaching and growing their presence in Africa.
Mr. Secretary, in your current role, you have a lot of opportunities to advance these initiatives, but you've also got tremendous business experience. Could we get your thoughts on approaching Africa and some of the opportunities and challenges there?
One of the topics that intrigues me is how can the business community or how can we in U.S. government facilitate the kind of market integration, market coordination that would help overcome the scale problem? What are the real reasons why there aren't free trade agreements that are better? Why are there differences in customs procedures, non-tariff trade barriers, and how can we deal with those? Because a lot of the issues you're raising are issues of a lack of homogeneity in practices among them, it seems to me. So has anybody given real thought to what mechanism there is or what series of strategies we could apply to try to deal with that issue?
I'm going to offer some thoughts at the end, but David.
I'd like not just to understand the problems, but have a path towards solutions.
David, do you want to interject?
Sure. On the demand side, I'm not going to recite to you the demographics and, the markets that are being developed. But I think we take for granted in a country where the Commerce Department developed the notion of GDP, the fact that these signals are harder to come by, and not necessarily just at a Pan-African context, but on a country-by-country basis, it's harder for companies to know where the real prospects are. I think as we view it from an OPIC perspective, those are primarily around the commodity space where we need to ensure there's the infrastructure there both roads and telecom and other ways of being able to move goods up the value chain, to be able to co-locate on processing facilities and truly move goods and services across markets. And OPIC stands ready to help with project finance, with political risk insurance, as well as support for private equity funds. And I also want to echo Takreem's point on the competition that's going on in Africa right now on a geopolitical basis. As the President said recently on his Asian trip, we need to ensure that Eurasia remains open and free to U.S. goods and services. I think the same thing is true of Africa. The competition that's going on there is about American prosperity, but it's also about American security. So I'd encourage companies to seek out opportunities that promote both of those as well.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for this committee, for this report. It's very helpful to kind of get the industry's view. I think there's a real opportunity here. I think having spent the last 20 years working in Africa, I recognize firsthand the competition that this report talks about. And it's an area that USTDA and Commerce have worked well together in the past, is picking some priority countries and figuring out, looking around the table here, the different government agencies, the private companies that are investing in these companies. Our competitors are going in as a monolithic, here's what we are providing. And we are going kind of in a fragmented approach. And I think USTDA and Commerce have been successful in China and India making the case of here's the US presence. And I think that the PAC-DBI has a real opportunity to come together, pick some priority markets, and make the case of here's what the US government, here's what the private sector is bringing. So we start to overcome this competition issue of China's doing this, but the US is doing this, this, and this. Because I think there's some real benefits we can gain if we work together through this PAC-DBI initiative to create a single message of what is the commitment to African countries. So we're seen as a more monolithic US approach.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I want to answer your question directly. Why is there not free trade occurring? Why is it not happening in these regional pockets? UPS as a company, we operate in 220 countries and territories. We cross borders every day. We operate in 51 of the 54 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And you know what? A lot stops at the borders. The border processes are one of the biggest impediments to trade, because the reality is those processes involve a lot of delays. They involve outdated procedures. Nothing is really done electronically, which allows for efficiency and security screening and the kind of movement of goods across borders that I would say, take for granted in more developed countries. And the reality is we have an agreement that has already been agreed on by a vast majority of the members of the World Trade Organization, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. And that agreement represents that foundation from which we can build more trade opportunities. If we can work with the countries in partnership with the World Customs Organization, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, as well as companies like UPS, IBM, and many others in the room here that are working in partnership to help these countries improve their border processes, I believe that once you transform those processes, you allowed more trade to happen. Because one of the challenges that exists is in those processes, there's so much corruption and bribery at those borders. There's a lot of security risks that occur there. If we can turn those processes electronic, bitstreams don't ask for bribes. We can move goods across borders, and you know what? That takes the risk out of the supply chains, and those supply chains then can create more opportunities for American goods to go into these markets and create new manufacturing opportunities and grow with them. And that's fundamental. So start there and drive that process. That would be something meaningful.
Now, are the governments aware of that problem, and do they care about it?
It's mixed. So we've got some countries that are willing to work in partnership, and that's why the prioritization that I know the NSC wants to give to a handful of countries that this government works with, let's make them the pilots, and in many ways those positive examples of when you create the right customs processes, you create a lot more economic opportunity. And that's...
Are there obvious candidates to be the test cases?
There's a... There's a number of countries that are already in the pipeline. Morocco, I know, is one of them that has been working in partnership. We have activities underway in Kenya. There's a number of others that have indicated an interest in working in partnership. We can follow up with a specific list, but if there's countries that are willing to address those border processes, they represent a good ally for us in terms of addressing some of the challenges that keep American companies from exporting and growing in those markets. So we can get you a more detailed list.
Okay, because that might help as a shopping list for the trip we're planning in 2018. Because I think to make that trip worthwhile, we really need to have specific agendas, specific targets, specific things that we want to get done. Because at the 40,000-foot level, we can go on forever. We need to do things at the ground level.
Does anybody else want to add some additional comments? Yeah, Kevin.
That's okay. So I just want to echo what she said. Here at the NSC, we're doing research on better electronics. I can yell. I'm from a big family. The connectivity issue is huge. And I think people don't quite understand how much this traps Africa into a lot of really bad things. The feedback loops are really, really bad with this. The economic research shows that if you double the efficiency of 2 ports, that it has the economic effect, same economic effect as having the geographic distance between those ports. And so in some sense, Africa is very far away from the rest of the world because of these connectivity issues, whether that is the physical infrastructure or the processes at the border or anything else that slows it down. And the reasons for this is not simply that it costs a little more to ship things by UPS or even quite a bit more, but that if you have unreliable supply chains, then companies have to hold tremendous amounts more inventories. So the research shows that companies in these countries with poor connectivity have this huge additional cost of inventory carrying. And given the cost of capital is very high, either explicitly or implicitly in these countries, you are imposing a tax on those countries of several percentage points of GDP, just from that one effect alone. And then in addition to that, we talk about the resource curse, and I've pondered this quite a bit with Africa, where it's hard to get them out of this resource curse situation, and the economics of that are difficult, but then the politics of that are as well. You encourage the corruption and the bribery, where there's this 1 or 2 commodities that you can have very corrupt deals about who gets to access that and on what terms. But you cannot have development of more complicated supply chains where Africa gets integrated into the rest of the world without improving the logistics significantly. And once you do that, then the economy is not solely dependent on the vagaries of commodities markets, which then implies tremendous volatility of the currency. As somebody said down here, I couldn't see who it was, but there's currency issues that then result from that. And so then you have a lot of risk that investors perceive, and so investors don't want to invest because there's this huge currency risk, and so you just have this whole series of dominoes that fall over from this problem. So I think a bigger focus on that would be helpful. I noticed that it's mentioned in the back of the report. I would put it in the front of the report because I think it's quite an important issue that we should focus on.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Connie Hamilton from USTR. I just wanted to comment on this discussion. I think we sometimes forget that we're talking about 55 independent sovereign nations. They are not monolithic. They are not joined together. Even when we talk about their regional integration in their regional organizations, they still act very independently. So the fact that they're working on a continent-wide FTA, and we all have reservations about what that's going to do and what that's going to mean, but by the end of 2017, they hope to have at least in place a framework where they're working together to address some of these issues. They recognize the challenge that they have in being small markets and diverse. And they're trying to deal with that. And so I think that if we try to work with them carefully on how they plan their FTA, this continent-wide thing, that we engage with them and offer ideas and capacity building assistance to help them get to a place where they should be as they're putting together this package, I think that would be helpful and help address some of these issues.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
This session is generating a lot of interest, sorry, with the State Department. Just to come back on what Connie said, when Chairman Fockey just visited for the ministerial with Secretary Tillerson, he raised the issue of the RECs as well. So what the AU is going to start doing, starting next June, is convoke all of the regional economic units to their AU meeting. And the idea there is to push forward with customs and border issues and others, the things that you were talking about, what's happening at the border and how can they get intra-African trade. Your report touched on the fact that it's at 16%, it's suboptimal, it's really hampering their growth. And so this goes into the free trade, but as well AU fully understanding that and trying to work with the RECs to get regional energy behind that. And that's something that we support.
Any other additional comments? I think it's a good time to move on to the next section, focusing on competing in the African market. And here the Council explored the biggest issues that come into play in terms of ensuring a level playing field for American businesses as they grow and expand across the continent. And fundamentally, the obstacles are there because there's an aggressive approach by foreign governments with previous colonial interests. Think the French, think the Dutch, think the Belgians, think the Germans, and think about the Chinese expansion into and across the continent, and a lot of the advocacy efforts that go in support of their businesses competing in the continent. There's also obviously the local content requirements and some of the most burdensome public procurement procedures that all put U.S. companies at a tremendous disadvantage. And so really focusing on those issues is going to help ensure that quality goods and services that American companies are known for are not unfairly hindered because the playing field just isn't level. And so I'd like to turn to our chairman, Jay Ireland, to comment on that whole of government ecosystem that enables U.S. companies to be able to compete effectively.
Okay, thanks, Laura. When you look at the whole of government approach, we see many other governments from around the world in Africa competing in a way that we do not. And that can be as far-ranging as bringing a fully financed deal with the associated companies in their country into the deal and presenting it to the government with a concessionary loan that basically usurps the public procurement role because it's a government-to-government deal. So we see that. We also have aspects of certain aid that gets provided to countries around healthcare that would be tied to from governments that then bring their home country products or companies in as the sole provider for the equipment and services around that. So it's not just China or the East, it's also Europe. Germany has a Marshall Plan utilizing the G20, focused on Africa. It's mainly now focused on around 6 countries. These are the things that we continually see as a competition. Another way to think about it is, from a standpoint of speed, is that we, an American company, would come in, put together a deal, put the pricing together, present that potential to the government, whether it's a power plant, a road, a rail, and then go try to get financing and put a financing package together. It takes quite a long time. The competition comes in as the whole of government approach with, here it is, it's done, boom, we can start and break ground in a project within 6 months or whatever. So it's a very impactful one for a company's head of state, or a country's head of state, as looking at different election cycles as well to get things accomplished. So as we look at what we can do as the U.S. government and U.S. companies is to, again, marshal the resources that we have, which are very substantial between USTDA, OPIC, EXIM, MCC, USAID, et cetera, which now operate in somewhat of a disparate manner and really focus through on a strategic notion of what we want to do in development finance. And it doesn't always have to be loans. There can be certain credit enhancement facilities, insurance, not just on political risk, but also, which we do have a product with OPIC, but also on credit risk as well. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for all of us to work together to really provide that capability and really have a stamp, if you will, of projects around countries that says, you know, here's what a combination of the U.S. government and U.S. companies can bring to the economic growth of that specific country.
Thanks, Jay. Mr. Secretary, would you like to add some thoughts?
Oh. Well, all of those entities exist. Why is it that they haven't been able to be accessed by you fellows?
We have been able to access it. It's not in a question of access. It's a question of how we go to market. So we've done projects with plenty of projects with OPIC, plenty of projects with EXIM, and we put together the project, all of the, let's say an independent power project, all the pricing, et cetera, the environmental work that has to be done. And then we look at OPIC or EXIM to fund the debt or the equity, and they go through their underwriting process. And at that point in time, so it's a combination of that speed, number one. And number two is we're sourcing the deals, which is fine. But then there's also the potential to work underneath a government-to-government discussion, which then somewhat alleviates a lot of the, can enhance the speed, but also alleviates a lot of the competition. I don't know, Andrew, if you want to comment on the one you have in Kenya.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Kenya is a great example of where there was an MOU put in place by Commerce, and we were able to work directly with the government, with EXIM, OPEC, Commerce, and State, and putting together this deal. And that was one of the deals that we signed in August. I think is a great example of that, of having that MOU structure in place 2 years ago, and then we came in, worked with the government on structuring the deal and tying in the different agencies on putting together that whole value chain. And if we can do more of that, and we've talked a little bit about what other MOUs could we put in place in other strategic countries to be able to utilize that same approach.